In the autumn of 1943, a contingent of British troops occupied a transit camp in North Africa, a holding ground between evacuation and reassignment, overseen by military command, but isolated enough that its own governance had calcified into informal hierarchy and rumor. The men had obeyed orders for so long that obedience had become invisible, a reflex like breathing. Then an official notice arrived. Camp elections for a new leadership council, sanctioned by command, conducted under the Red Cross Observers' Watch. The men stared at the notice as if it were written in cipher. For years they had surrendered choice. Where to go, what to do, whether to live or die. Now they were asked to choose. It was not combat. It was not escape. It was something stranger and more dangerous. The sudden weight of agency in a place where agency had been forbidden. The election became a mirror. Some men recognized themselves, their conscience, their judgment, their right to refuse obedience to the wrong voice. Others saw only chaos. The camp fractured not along ranks or regiments, but along a new fault line. Those who believed democracy could survive in a cage, and those certain it would suffocate. What began as a bureaucratic exercise became a reckoning with what they were actually fighting for, not a flag, not a nation, but the right to say no. And in a place where saying no had always cost everything, that right would demand a terrible price. Chapter 1. The order arrives. The notice appeared on the camp board on a Tuesday, typed on military letterhead, bearing the stamp of command and the signature of the Red Cross Observer. Sergeant James Whitmore read it twice before the words stopped swimming. Camp elections to be held within 14 days. All enlisted men aged 18 and above eligible to vote. A council of 5 men to be elected for a term of 6 weeks, responsible for representing troop welfare to command. "It's a trick," said Private Davies, shoulder-checking Whitmore as he scanned the board. "They're testing who'll stick out. They'll remember." Whitmore had heard this kind of talk before, the superstition of men in cages, fear disguised as wisdom. The camp commandant, Colonel Ashford, confirmed it in assembly that evening. He stood on the parade ground as the sun bled copper against the desert, and his voice carried the tone of a man reading instructions he barely believed himself. "This is a Royal Army initiative," he said, "to improve morale and communication. Command wants to know if democratic process can function under field conditions. You'll conduct an orderly election, you'll respect the outcome. Observers will monitor the integrity of the vote." "Democracy," someone muttered behind Whitmore. "They've rationed us for 3 years and now they're handing out democracy." But Whitmore watched the faces of the younger men, the conscripts who'd never had authority over anything. Their eyes widened. Not with hope, exactly, with something closer to vertigo. By nightfall, the camp hummed with whispered politics. In the tents, over thin soup, across the latrines, the men began calculating. Who would listen? Who had authority they'd follow? Who could negotiate with command? The apparatus of choice, dormant for so long, suddenly flickered to life. Whitmore lay on his cot, listening to Davies and a man named Harper argue about what the election even meant. "It means nothing," Harper said. "They'll override the results if they don't like them." "Maybe," Davies replied, "or maybe they're desperate enough to let us pretend we matter." Whitmore said nothing. He was thinking about the weight of the ballot, a scrap of paper where a man could mark a name and for the first time in years make something happen. It was terrifying. The sand outside the tent hissed in the wind. Somewhere in the camp, someone was drafting a platform. Someone was counting allies. The cage had not changed, but inside it, men were learning to stand. Chapter 2. Reluctant candidates by day 4, 5 men had been nominated. 3 withdrew immediately. Sergeant Edward Finch accepted because he was senior, and refusal seemed cowardly. Private Martin Cole accepted because he was ambitious and had never learned when to be afraid. And Corporal William Shaw accepted because the other candidates seemed worse, and someone had to take the weight. Shaw sat in the commandant's office, summoned for verification of eligibility, and felt the unreality of it. Ashford was courteous, almost embarrassed. "You understand this is non-binding," Ashford said. "You advise, I decide. Command decides." "Yes, sir. Your election will be observed. The Red Cross wants to document the process." Shaw nodded. The Red Cross, neutral observers, recording this strange experiment in a camp surrounded by empire and war. "Good man," Ashford said, as if Shaw had just volunteered for a suicide run instead of accepting a role that might get him killed by his own unit if he made the wrong enemies. In the evenings the men gathered, not formally, but in the way water finds cracks. The candidates were scrutinized. Finch was steady but old guard, likely to defer to command. Cole was charismatic but untested under pressure. Shaw was cautious, which some saw as integrity and others saw as weakness. The fault lines emerged quickly. The men who'd been in camp longest trusted the hierarchy and wanted candidates who would maintain it. The men rotated through recently. Transit troops waiting reassignment wanted change in rations, in work assignments, in the small cruelties that compound in captivity. Harper argued for Finch. He knows how command thinks. He can negotiate. Davies pushed for Cole. "We need someone willing to push back. Finch is too comfortable here." Whitmore listened to both and felt the weight of the choice. Not abstract, not comfortable. Real. If he voted for Finch and conditions worsened, it was his fault. If he voted for Cole and Cole failed, it was his fault. The responsibility of choice was suffocating. By the 10th day, Whitmore had developed a headache that wouldn't break. Democracy, he thought, was a luxury purchased with the absence of consequence. Here, every choice carried weight, every vote was a moral signature. The night before the election, he lay awake, imagining the ballot in his hand, imagining the moment of marking, the small rebellion of consent or resistance, the small power of a man saying, "This one. I choose this one." He had never chosen anything that mattered. Now, he could not sleep. Chapter 3. The Campaign. The campaign lasted 5 days and felt like a siege. Cole posted handwritten notices on the latrines, promising doubled ration allowances, impossible, and early rotation for transit troops, beyond his authority. Men clustered around his platform, hungry for the possibility that someone might fight for them, that power might bend toward mercy. Finch said nothing. He simply stood during morning roll call, steady, predictable, wearing his rank like armor. Men who valued stability gravitated toward him. Shaw distributed his statement in careful, measured terms. "I will listen. I will ask the right questions. I will not promise what I cannot deliver, but I will push against every boundary." It was honest and therefore unconvincing. Honesty was worthless in a campaign. Whitmore found himself positioned as a mediator, not candidate, but opinion maker. Men asked him what he thought. He deflected, but they kept asking. His choices would matter, his vote would ripple. On day 3, he discovered why the election truly frightened him. It wasn't the voting itself. It was the aftermath. Once the men had chosen, they would be complicit. Complicit in the system, complicit in each other's fate. Democracy meant shared responsibility. In a cage, shared responsibility was another cage. He cornered Shaw on the parade ground, pulling him aside. "If you win," Whitmore said quietly, "they'll blame you when nothing changes. They'll blame you when command ignores you. Democracy needs consent, but consent requires believing your voice matters. And here," he gestured at the camp, the wire, the guards, "our voices don't matter." Shaw was quiet. "Then maybe that's the point. Maybe the mattering isn't the result. Maybe it's the choosing." Whitmore didn't argue, but he understood then that Shaw would lose. Honest men always did. By evening, the camp had split into visible factions. Finch supporters moved in one rhythm, Cole supporters clustered tighter, more vocal, sensing momentum. Shaw supporters were scattered, quieter, perhaps sadder. And Whitmore, standing between them, felt the election not as a democratic exercise, but as a fracture, a line drawn through the camp, dividing men who had survived together. Once the ballot was cast, the division would be permanent. CTA Nervo 1. If this story feels real to you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Chapter 4. The vote election day arrived with bureaucratic precision. A table was set up in the mess tent. 2 observers, 1 Red Cross, 1 military, sat with ballots boxed in clear containers. The men lined up as they had lined up for 3 years, orderly, quiet, obedient even in their rebellion. Whitmore stood in line behind Harper, watching the process unfold. Each man received his ballot, marked his choice in a screened booth, privacy, a dignity afforded for the first time, folded it and deposited it in the box. The physicality of it struck him. This was not abstract. This was a hand moving, a mark made, a choice solidified in ink. The man at the booth could change his mind 1,000 times in his head, but once the mark was made, he belonged to it. When Whitmore's turn came, he entered the booth, a simple partition of canvas, and held the ballot. 5 names printed neatly, 5 possible futures for the camp. He had spent 5 days unsure. Now, in the silence of the booth, the choice clarified. Not because of campaigning or logic, but because of something simpler. He thought of Shaw's face when Whitmore had questioned whether voting mattered. Maybe it's the choosing. Whitmore marked Shaw's name. His hand was steady. He folded the ballot and inserted it into the box. The observer noted the time. It was done. By evening, the ballots were counted. Observers present, commandant present, the tally official and irrevocable. Shaw had won. Not by landslide, Finch was close, but decisively enough. Cole came third. The other 2 candidates received scattered support. The remainder of scattered men. Whitmore felt the weight shift in the camp. The men who'd voted for Finch or Cole looked at Shaw differently now, not with hostility, but with calculation. He was real. He had power, however limited. His decisions would affect them. Shaw stood as the results were announced, his face grey. He understood what Whitmore understood. The voting was over. The real conflict was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Winner's Burden. Shaw's first act was to request an audience with Colonel Ashford. He brought no demands, only questions. What was the council's actual authority? What could be negotiated? Where were the boundaries? Ashford's answers were polite and comprehensive in their limitations. The council could advise on sanitation, work schedules, minor camp operations. The council could recommend ration adjustments. Command would hear them. Command would decide. "You're glorified maintenance workers," Harper said bitterly when Shaw reported back. "Democracy that advises its own jailers." "It's more than we had before," Shaw replied quietly. But the frustration was spreading. Men who'd voted for Shaw felt cheated. Men who'd voted for Finch felt vindicated in their skepticism. The election had unified no one. It had only clarified divisions. By the second week, Shaw was exhausted. He moved between factions, listening to complaints he couldn't resolve, making promises he couldn't keep, holding the weight of men's hopes for change in a system incapable of changing. Whitmore watched him deteriorate. The careful, honest man being ground down by the machinery of democratic expectation. Shaw had been right about one thing: the mattering was in the choosing. But the aftermath was a different kind of burden. One night, Shaw found Whitmore alone in the tent. "I don't know how to do this," Shaw said. His voice was barely audible. "I don't know how to represent men when representation means nothing. When every answer I give them is no, when every promise I make will break." Whitmore didn't have comfort to offer, so he said, You're learning what all power means, the gap between what people need and what you can give. That gap is where conscience lives. Shaw nodded slowly. And if my conscience tells me the election was meaningless? Then you'll have learned something true, Whitmore said, and the men will learn it too, eventually. Chapter 6. Escalation. On the 16th day of Shaw's council, order came down from command. The camp would receive a transport contingent, new troops rotating through, temporary assignment. Housing would be tight, rations would adjust downward, discipline would be heightened. The men looked to Shaw. This was the test. Could democracy push back against command? Shaw requested an audience with Ashford. He brought documents, calculations, logistics, proposals for rotating assignments that might ease the transition. He brought the weight of the men's anxiety, asking for something, anything, that might matter. Ashford was sympathetic and immovable. "The order comes from divisional command," he said. "Your recommendations are noted, but the situation requires accommodation, not negotiation." Shaw returned to the camp and called an assembly. He reported the facts without embellishment. The men listened in silence. Whitmore could see the realization spreading. The election had meant nothing. Voting had changed nothing. The men were precisely where they had been, subject to forces beyond their influence. But then something unexpected happened. After the assembly, the men didn't riot or protest. Instead, they organized. Davies and Harper worked with Shaw to draft a rotation schedule that would distribute burden equitably. The younger men helped clear additional latrine trenches. The older soldiers reinforced the tent structures. The camp wasn't rebelling. It was cooperating. Not because command demanded it, but because, through Shaw's election, through the exercise of voting, through the small ritual of democratic choice, the men had recognized themselves as a collective. They had agency, not as individuals against command, but as a unit supporting each other. CTA number 2. If this battle still echoes in your mind, it helps these untold memories stay alive. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The transport troops arrived 3 days later. The camp was ready. Space had been made. Rations had been adjusted. The integration was seamless, not because command had arranged it, but because the men had chosen cooperation. Shaw's election was ending. By protocol, new elections would be held in 6 weeks. But something had changed in the interim. The men moved differently. They spoke differently. They had tasted choice, however limited, and it had altered them. Whitmore overheard Davies and Harper arguing about the next election, but the argument was different now. It was about ideas, not just personality. It was about what they'd learned from Shaw's term, that honesty was valuable, that limits existed, and acknowledging them was more important than denying them. On the last day of Shaw's council, Whitmore found him sitting alone near the wire, watching the sunset turn the desert the color of old blood. "You know what I learned?" Shaw said, not looking at Whitmore. "I learned that democracy isn't about getting what you want. It's about recognizing that you exist, that your voice, however small, has weight, that you matter enough to be asked to choose." Whitmore sat beside him. "The rations didn't change," Shaw continued. "Command ignored half my recommendations. We're still confined, still subject to orders. But something is different now. We voted. We chose. That's not nothing." "Is it enough?" Whitmore asked. Shaw was quiet for a long time. "No, but it's a beginning, and maybe that's what democracy always is. Not a destination, but a refusal to stop choosing, a refusal to accept that we're just subjects." The sun dropped below the horizon. Guards changed watch. The camp settled into evening routines. But the men moved with something new in their bearing. Not hope exactly, but something like recognition. They had touched power, however briefly, and they would never be entirely subject again.